Money Show.
Personal Finance with Warren Ingram.
Well, I'm a parent, as I think you know, and one of the big choices, one of the big arguments I've watched and expressed different views, often contradictory views, because as a parent you're allowed to think different things at different times, is on the government versus private school debate, and it can get very complicated. Everyone has their own view. I think often with that decision, what kind of school is your child going to go to, it can be very hard to remove your aspirations for yourself away from your child and to make it about them. It can be very tough to do. At the same time, you get sucked and pushed and pulled in different ways, and everyone who knows the child will have their own opinion. Probably a good moment to sit back and hear the view of Warren Ingram, certified financial planner at Galileo Capital, as we ask the question, are fancy private schools worth the money? And from time to time, someone will come and tell me how much the really top private schools cost. And every time I feel I need to wipe my eyes because it makes your eyes water.
It does. And from what I can see this year, it's quite far in excess of 400,000 Rand per year per child for the most expensive school in South Africa. And actually quite a few schools are charging more than 400,000 Rand a year. So, you just work that out over a career of 5 years, hoping your child gets through the school in the requisite time, and it becomes kind of a 2 million Rand exercise at least. And also what we know, Stephen, is that school fees don't go up by 3% a year. They go up certainly quite a bit quicker in the private sector than they do in the public sector. So it's probably going to end up at a fair amount more than 2 million over a child's high school career.
And I mean, how does that? I mean, you could probably send someone half the way to Harvard with that.
I had to have a look, and it's not to say that Harvard's the be all and the end all, but it is possibly one of the most prestigious universities in the world, if not the most, and it works out at about 990,000 Rand for a year to go to Harvard, and the most expensive school in South Africa would be almost exactly half that cost. I think going to Harvard makes sense to me from the point of view that it probably opens a tremendous amount of doors for you if you graduate from there and you're looking for a position. I'm not sure that the same applies to simply going to a very expensive school, and certainly one that wouldn't necessarily rank in the top 10 in the world.
Okay, we're going to tease this out over the next half an hour. Your views on this, please. 072-702-1702. What worked for you? What would you have changed, particularly if you've already been through it? You might have been to a really good government or a really bad government or a really bad private or a really good private school. Would you do it differently? Did you decide to do something different for your children as a result? And I suppose, Warren, we need to look at some of the research on this, because the obvious question is, and there are plenty of just excellent government schools in this country, do you go to them or do you go to a more affordable private school? And that's where things start to get really tough, because the difference between them in terms of cost and the difference in terms of outcome gets narrower and narrower.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those fields where social scientists and psychologists have spent a lot of time trying to figure out how much of an impact does education have on a child's overall outcome over their schooling and maybe university careers. And it's much more complex than one would think, because you have to take into account age, what was the child's education background coming into the school, what sort of support did they get, etc. But as in many of these kinds of things, the Americans have spent an enormous amount of money studying this, and when you look at the outcome for kids who go to an expensive private school, and in the States you get these very high performing no fee public schools, and the difference in outcome over a child's, let's say their version of matric and how they get into university, there is almost no difference in the performance of those children. And I don't mean in the exact mark that they get, but I mean the outcome, the ability to get into a good university and succeed at that university. And so it tells you, certainly, in America, and I don't think South Africa would be any different, that actually, the private school effect is maybe not as big as we would think on the outcomes of a child's education. So, in your intro, I thought you phrased it really well. A lot of the time, it will maybe be our aspirations for our children, and we think that they need to go there, but the data doesn't show the same effect. It doesn't actually bear that out.
So, I mean, I think, you'll do a tour of the school, right? Almost all of the schools will let you do that. And you'll look at the facilities, and that does matter. Now, some private schools will be 85,000 Rand a year. Some will be 200, some will be, as you say, 400, or some of those might be boarding. But you look at those and the facilities, I mean, they can't be that different for the price difference. A science lab is a science lab. I mean, unless they've got the Large Hadron Collider thingamabob there, I mean, what are you doing?
So I think we can narrow down two things that do make a big impact on a child's education performance or outcome, and one of them is the size of the class. So if you're in a class of 35 versus a class of 15 or 20, being in a smaller class certainly makes a difference and a positive impact. So being in a smaller class generally will help. And I guess it's a fairly obvious point, because the teacher is able to give more attention to each child than if they're in a big class. But to complicate things, that a child who goes as one of 15 compared to a child in one of 28 in a class can be impacted by the quality of the teacher. So a very high quality teacher can get fantastic outcomes from a class of 28 compared to a fairly average teacher teaching 15. So I would say, when you're a parent, you have no ability to judge, how each teacher is going to perform, for the time that your child's going to be there. But you can look at it and say, okay, class size is a factor, and certainly some private schools will limit the number of children in each class, and that, yes, that makes an impact. And then the facilities, I think especially if you want your child to get a fairly well-rounded education where they participate in the cultural stuff, the music stuff, the sports stuff, and the education, then facilities will make a difference, and possibly some private schools will have fairly good facilities. Equally, and I'm fairly open in my bias. I went to a fantastic public school, and it had brilliant facilities that I think would stack up to any school in South Africa, and it didn't cost, and still doesn't cost, anything like 400,000 Rand a year. So I would say for a parent, if you're sending your child to a school that costs more than 400,000, you have to know that there are very high quality public schools and then good quality private schools that are charging 85 or 100,000 Rand a year, and then the question is, now you've got decent class size, you've got good facilities. What on earth are you getting for the extra 2 or 3 times the price by sending your child to a much more expensive school?
So one of the things I hear in this conversation, I'm not sure that I agree with it, but one of the things that people will say is that there's a network effect, and that because you are meeting people who are going to be decision makers, this goes the argument. And let me just be clear about one thing, Warren, before we go any further. Whenever I speak to people in the Shapeshifter segment, almost the one thing that almost all have in common is with, I think, since, in of all of the interviews I've done, with maybe 3 or 4 exceptions that I can think of off the top of my head, almost all of them have gone through what I would call good suburban, 1 or 2 very good townships. So think of Morris Isaacson, for example, and then the rest private school. 1 or 2 have been old enough to have gone not quite to a missionary school, but a school kind of coming out of that tradition in the Eastern Cape. So high school in particular makes an absolute difference to outcomes. It's the American version of the Ivy League. Joe Biden referred to this as the river of power. If you went to the Ivy League colleges in the US, you could be in the river of power for the rest of your life. And I think those schools provide the same function in South Africa. So the argument then becomes, at a private school, you will get a better network. You will know people forever. Now, I went to a similar school to yours, government school, possibly better than yours, just because of which one it was. But I am not convinced of the network effect, but many people are. How do you see it?
I think you would be surprised as to who would benefit, and I think the answer is there is a network effect. It's I'm not saying it's blindingly obvious, but when you're exposed to fellow pupils who are let's say from high income families, the likelihood that they can they can walk into a private university or go overseas and go to prestigious institutions and then possibly walk into better jobs at corporates, etc. Over their lifetime, people who are exposed to that kind of environment will have a decent network, and it's not a guarantee that anything that you'll benefit from that just because of the network, but it's different to someone who grows up. Let's just say that grows up in a township in South Africa or in a rural area in South Africa where there is none of that. That doesn't mean that the one person will succeed and the other one is guaranteed to fail. But being able to talk to people who run their own businesses or have whose parents have high-end jobs or are able to network at a different level, it does improve your exposure. However, what we find with studies is that the kids that come from low-income families that get bursaries and scholarships to these expensive schools, they derive the greatest benefit from the network because they are plugging into something that that maybe isn't available to them where they grew up. But the kids who grow up in high income families, they're born to that network. They already have it. So they get no noticeable benefit from being in the network of the school because actually they grew up in a network of their own. Their parents are in a network, etc. So the irony around this network effect is that those who can afford it actually don't really need it, and those who can't afford the schools, who maybe are get the scholarships, they are the ones that get the greatest benefit. So I would say it's always going to be fairly nuanced in this area, but that tells you that actually blending children from diverse economic backgrounds does have a huge impact on everybody, and I think very positive.
We've got a couple of voice notes coming through on this, Warren, because it's such an interesting topic on 072 702 1702.
Hi, Stephen. When it comes to outcomes, I still don't see the difference between the private schools and these no-fee schools. All our children went to no-fee schools. And the outcomes is we also had our distinctions in matric, 7 and 6 and 5. And today they're working in global companies. They went to university, UWC and UCT. They all got, not all, but they got the Golden Key Awards. And I'm very pleased. I don't see why we should pay for the same curriculum, pay more. Well, this year or last year, George proved that you can have all those distinctions at a public school. So I don't see why we should pay exorbitant prices. You must just give good support. Andrew from Mitchell's Plain.
Andrew, thank you. Yeah, very powerful voice note there. Gabby saying, schools, government Model C schools are excellent. My kids did very well there. So far, no one backing the private schools on this one. Maybe they're all out, I don't know, networking.
The Money Show. Personal finance with Warren Ingram.
8 minutes to 8. All right, more voice notes on this question, Warren. Government school or private school?
Good evening. This is Selma from Roodepoort. My son went to Allen Glen High, which is a normal government school between the years 2000 and 2004. He did very well. He obtained 4 degrees, one of which is a doctor's degree. So I can't say that he did any worse there than he would have done at a private school, and it cost a lot less. Thanks for a lovely show. Bye.
Thanks for that, Selma. So, look, Warren, I mean, certainly if you do the numbers, lots of people coming sort of on your side of this.
Yeah, and I mean, I want to talk about this, the affordability and the impact on families as well, because I think that's important. But just to say one thing that's quite interesting is the schools that have some sort of fairly strict entrance criteria. So let's just say at a high school level where the prospective pupils have to write some kind of an entrance exam and go through some kind of a portfolio exercise to show why they're going to stack up as a pupil at this school. Those schools tend to perform well, and the outcomes for kids in those schools are pretty good. But what's interesting is the conclusion is actually that the kids make the school better, not the school makes the kids better. They just happen to select and are very choosy on who they allow into their school, and so you get this kind of selection of very high performance children. I'm not sure those are happy kids, but that's a different question. So I think just understanding that when we go into the data here, where there is demand for education, and I think in South Africa the Model C schools are a good example. Sometimes there are 1,000 applications to get into a school where there might only be 100 openings, and so schools are able to kind of select, I guess, somewhat who comes in the door from the local area, and it's no surprise then that these Model C schools are performing incredibly well, whether it be in academics, culture, or on the sports field. And so that just understanding now that it's very difficult to argue that a top Model C school isn't as good as a private school. But the thing for me that really worries me in our country is there are a very small number of families that can afford to spend 2 million a year per child on a high school education. And if you've got 2 kids, that's 4 million a year of after-tax money that you have to set aside. And my question there is, what are the families doing to their own financial position to be able to afford that kind of an education? And what kind of stress is the family operating under? And how much pressure is being transferred, perhaps unintentionally, to the child who just wants to go to school and kind of get through and have a good education. The pressure on that whole family, I think we shouldn't underestimate. And it's one of the things that I would love to kind of share with parents is just be very careful about what you wish for in a situation like this. Compromising your retirement and the other support that you can provide your child through kind of maybe a bit more relaxed environment. Is it worth the emotional cost and the like of then putting your kids in a school that is going to be difficult for them financially? And I can't come up with a good answer to that. I'm not convinced that I would do that.
And I mean, the other thing is, very expensive private schools in particular come with a whole lot of other costs. And if you are going to battle to keep up with that, not only does it put stress on you, but you do not want your child to feel uncomfortable through high school. So much of our trauma in later life is because of things that happened at high school. It's that kind of period. And if you are going to feel out or not with it or not good enough for financial reasons as a teenager, you'll feel that for a long time afterwards, and you don't want that for your child.
No, and just simple things like where did you go on the holidays, and what are you wearing after school, like the latest brands, et cetera, and I think the schools, to give credit to the educators, they're quite aware of this, and they'll do as much as they can to level things out. I guess it's why uniforms are important in that context, but it doesn't change the reality that some kids will know that that they're not in the same economic league as their friends, and just going to visit each other's houses will bring that out. And so I guess again looking at bigger schools that are government schools where it's a much more economically diverse kind of cross section of parents putting their kids into schools like that. I think that's much more normal in the South African context, and maybe kids can kind of be just a normal pool there of of a sample, and they're not going to be standing out, I guess, is really what I'm trying to say. And so for me, again, I know it sounds incredibly biased that it's not that private schools don't have value. They do, but I would just ask parents to consider this incredibly carefully.
Warren Ingram, thank you so much. Financial advisor, co-founder of Galileo Capital. Such an interesting topic. Last voice note to end off.
Good evening, 702 listeners. Personally, I don't think it makes a difference if someone goes to a private school or public school. I think it just depends on the individual, how ambitious they are, their charisma, can they network, can they progress? Because you could send your child to a private school and they're not that type of person that will make use of the networks that they make at a private school. But
all right, yeah. So interesting to hear that. Thank you very much indeed for that. And Warren, thank you. As I say, such an important and interesting topic. That's something that we can discuss and debate for a very long time in personal finance.